Hello guys, welcome to another video, and in this one I'm going to be doing a bit of discussion on a defensive setup which I think I'm going to be making use of in my next build. And this setup makes use of a combination of mechanics to make it so that you pretty much only take chaos and physical damage from hits, allowing you to specialise into mitigating those two damage types. So the basic high level overview of this setup is the combination of the Divine Flesh Timeless Keystone with the Flawed Refuge unique shield. Divine Flesh makes 50% of all of the elemental damage that you take be taken as chaos damage instead, whilst providing a nice boost to maximum chaos resistance at the cost of preventing your energy shield from performing its basic function of absorbing damage. Meanwhile, the Flawed Refuge is a new unique shield which was only introduced to the game last league and made its way into the core game drop pool this league. And this shield makes 40% of the elemental damage that you take from hits be taken as physical damage instead, and it also has a decent chunk of block chance there too, while the downside modifier here, you take 100% of elemental damage from blocked hits, will barely have any impact on this build, since we only take 10% of any incoming elemental hit damage as elemental damage after our damage taken as modifiers have gone to work. So this basic setup will allow us to take 90% of incoming elemental hit damage as chaos or physical damage. Unfortunately, whilst the damage taken as modifier on Divine Flesh does work for damage over time, the one on the Flawed Refuge does not. And that means we're still going to absolutely need to cap out our elemental resistances, unless you want to fall over to the first elemental damage over time you encounter. Now, this particular setup is very strong combined with another defensive mechanic that has gained huge popularity this league, and that's stacking additional physical damage reduction, largely thanks to the new quality on Enduring Cry which was added last league that provides a very substantial amount of increased cooldown recovery rate. And this makes it not just possible but actually quite trivial to have a permanent Enduring Cry buff up all of the time. Enduring Cry provides a nice burst of life regeneration when used, and it will also grant endurance charges based on Warcry power, but importantly, its buff will grant additional physical damage reduction for each endurance charge you have, and this part of the ability can be kept up with 100% uptime. Now, I think the likelihood of using Ralakesh's Impatience in this type of build is quite high, because if you're relying on your endurance charges as most or all of your physical damage mitigation, you don't want a scenario where they fall off and you just fall over as a result. You'll be a bit slower after the movement speed removal this patch, but these boosts are still kinda crazy. And if you're stacking additional physical damage reduction using Enduring Cry, the most efficient use of endurance charges comes from the Juggernaut Ascendancy. The unflinching and unrelenting Ascendancy notables will together grant an extra maximum endurance charge and improve the additional physical damage reduction those charges provide, going from 4% to 5% each. So with the Juggernaut Ascendancy, you're at 4 maximum endurance charges, plus the 3 available on the passive tree, and you're potentially going to be stacking a further 2 maximum charges from rings. That could be the entry level version using Calm Signs, or a much higher budget version using synthesized implicit rings with +1 to maximum endurance charge, or even Precursor's emblems with desirable mods. This would bring you up to 9 maximum endurance charges, and do remember that if you're using Ralakesh's Impatience, you can also make use of Arn's Anguish in such a setup for all of the offensive benefits that this item provides without losing the defensive benefits of your endurance charges, which is a really strong combination. So at 9 maximum endurance charges with Unrelenting, you'd have 45% additional physical damage reduction. Add to that the buff from Enduring Cry for a further 18%, bringing you up to 63% additional physical damage reduction. That's good, but not enough just yet. Now, you can actually improve the additional PDR gained from the Enduring Cry buff using Warcry buff effect, but since this Warcry only grants 2% per endurance charge as a baseline value, you'd need increments of 50% Warcry buff effect for each additional percentage of reduction, and Warcry buff effect isn't the most trivial stat to get in the game. Unfortunately, only 41% Warcry buff effect can be found on the passive skill tree, from the Natural Authority wheel down at the bottom left of the tree, which means you're going to need to find that extra 9% elsewhere. You can get this stat on these unique items, but we're already using a shield slot for the Flawed Refuge, and you're unlikely to be wanting to use this claw. You can get a big chunk of this stat from the Searing Exarch body armor implicit. However, I'm going to be making use of a unique body armor, which I'll be talking about in just a moment, so I can't use that either. The last option you have outside of a standard League Crucible weapon tree is an elevated Warlord helmet modifier, which grants some Warcry buff effect. This one is serviceable, probably quite expensive to craft for a decent helmet, but especially doable this league with grave crafting. This would bump you over that 50% buff effect threshold, so Enduring Cry would now grant 3% additional PDR per endurance charge, so with 9 charges including Unrelenting, you'd have 72% raw physical damage reduction. In terms of where else you can get sources of additional physical damage reduction, well, since you're going to be using Divine Flesh, which is granted by a glorious vanity jewel in the name of Zibakwa, you could be on the lookout for a jewel which transforms one or several of the notables in its radius into a node called Automaton Studies. This node will grant either 3% or 4% additional physical damage reduction and some increased armor there too, and it shouldn't be too difficult to find a jewel with a few of these nodes within reach of a handful of points spent. You can actually use a very good website if you're interested in pursuing that. It's the Timeless Jewel Calculator, which will allow you to input the specific jewel and keystone you're after, and put in any specific nodes that you want, and you can customize which nodes you want those stats to appear on. And it will show all of those jewels that exist, and even allow you to take that data straight to the trade site to see if any of those exist for sale. So that's a great tool, and I'll link that in the description below if you're interested. There's also the Watcher's Eye Jewel mod if you're using Determination. This modifier can roll up to 8% additional physical damage reduction. And remember, there's Pantheon powers there as well. The Lunaris Major Pantheon power will grant 1% additional PDR per nearby enemy, up to 8%, while the Solaris Pantheon grants 6% additional PDR if there's only one enemy nearby. There's also the Gruthkul Minor Pantheon power for 1% additional PDR per hit you've taken recently, up to 5%, while Tukohama will grant 3% additional PDR per second while stationary, up to 9%. There's also the Oak Bandit power for 2% additional PDR and some other potentially useful stats there too. Now, one of the biggest issues this kind of setup will encounter is physical damage overwhelm, which is found as a monster modifier and also appears in a handful of other places in the game, such as Expedition Remnants, and in the current league it also appears on the Lantern of Aramor. Physical damage overwhelm bypasses a defender's physical damage reduction by the stated amount. In the case of Expedition Remnants, that's 100%, so all of your physical damage reduction is bypassed. No matter what you do with this kind of setup, you're going to want to avoid that at all costs. So how can we deal with physical damage overwhelm? Well, I'm going to be making use of an item I haven't used in a build in a very long time, the Doppelganger Guise unique body armor. Now this item is a very rare drop from the normal Maven encounter, and it has some interesting modifiers on it. It grants you an unhinged skill, which we'll discuss momentarily, 40 to 60% more crit chance while insane, corpse destruction from hits while insane, 30 to 40% less physical and chaos damage taken while sane, and regenerate 10% of life over 1 second when hit while sane. Now, the unhinged skill is basically a toggle to allow you to go from sane to insane and back, but by default you're sane. Now, this means that you can just ignore the unhinged ability if you want to and stay sane all of the time, for up to 40% less physical and chaos damage taken and 10% regen over a second whenever you're hit. This large of a less damage taken modifier is extremely rare, not to mention that it also works for damage over time, so you're going to be practically immortal to poison, bleeding and corrupted blood, since those damage over time effects first have to go through your chaos resistance or additional PDR depending on type, and then that damage is further lessened by this modifier, not to mention the regen that you'll have as a result of the hit which inflicted that ailment or debuff. The less physical damage taken modifier is going to be very good at lessening the impacts of any physical overwhelm, but you can also help to mitigate it further by incorporating some physical damage taken as chaos modifiers into your build. Damage taken as modifiers only function once, as they happen at the same time of the calculation, so you can't shift elemental damage into physical damage via the Flawed Refuge and then shift that same physical damage into chaos through one of these modifiers. but this will still help against those monsters that you encounter that deal physical damage with physical overwhelm. The armor and energy shield mastery can provide 10% of this stat, while you can get up to 18% of physical damage from hits taken as chaos damage on a helmet between a delve suffix modifier and an Eater of Worlds implicit, but you may already be using the helmet slot for that warlord modifier that we discussed earlier. There's also corrupted implicits found on shields. For example, this one I have here on my Flawed Refuge shield for up to 8% of physical hit damage taken as chaos damage. This portion of physical hit damage that you take as chaos damage won't be affected by the physical overwhelm, helping you mitigate its impact. So, the combination of the Flawed Refuge, Divine Flesh and the Doppelganger's Guise is quite powerful, but you can go a bit further still to help improve the mitigation against chaos damage and physical damage. For chaos damage, you can scale maximum chaos resistance. Again, the glorious Vanity Jewel can convert notables in its radius into another useful node. This one is called Cult of Chaos, and it provides some chaos resistance and 1% maximum chaos resistance there too. There's also a small cluster jewel notable, Born of Chaos, which appears on small clusters which provide chaos resistance. This one is very valuable, it grants 3% maximum chaos resistance, especially useful considering the shield slot is taken, so obtaining maximum resistance will be a lot less trivial. You can also make use of the armor and energy shield mastery to apply 10% of your armor to chaos damage taken from hits, which is good, but I'd say this is less likely to be as useful in this type of build because you're probably less likely to be scaling armor very much, if at all. And if you're not using the minor Pantheon power for additional PDR, you could instead use the Soul of Shikari upgrade for 5% reduced chaos damage taken for even more mitigation against chaos damage. And of course, as an endgame upgrade, you can be on the lookout for corrupted implicits on a Doppelganger's Guise. If you're playing a build which scales with gem levels, you'll likely be looking for gem level modifiers here, but you may wish to use some of the more defensive implicits that you can find, such as plus 1% to all maximum resistances, which includes chaos resistance, and also some things like reduced chaos damage taken and additional PDR while stationary. Meanwhile, the downside from Divine Flesh can be used as an upside. That's the modifier which makes all damage bypass energy shield. Well, if you're not using Eldritch Battery, you can make use of the Energy Shield Mastery for 10% less physical damage taken while on full Energy Shield, which is going to be all the time since all of the damage that you take is bypassing Energy Shield. This one's particularly strong in this setup when layered on top of all of the PDR stacking and the Doppelganger's Guise less damage taken modifier. Now, one of the strongest upsides of a setup like this is that you're practically immune to elemental penetration. It pretty much does nothing to you anymore because only 10% of that incoming elemental damage keeps the penetration. The rest is being taken as physical or chaos damage and doesn't carry over that damage type property. So things like Shapeables or other boss abilities that are scaled based on the penetration that they have, like the Uber Maven's Fireball, become a lot less scary. And that's going to be it for this one. I've been looking into making a build with the Flawed Refuge, as I didn't get around to it last league, and I really like this item. I just wanted to do a bit of discussion with all of the possibilities for this kind of setup, and I'll likely do a bit of an update video with my plans for the build, or maybe some defense calculations to see how effective you can make it. Thank you as always to my channel supporters over on Patreon, I appreciate you. If you'd like to support what I do here on YouTube, you can become a patron and gain access to some exclusive perks in the process. All of the information can be found on Patreon, the link is in the description below. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.